Okay, this first card is already telling me why the silence matters. Because look at her. She isn't chasing anything. She isn't reaching outward. She's sitting completely still inside this almost protected sphere while these 7 wands rise underneath her. And psychologically, the 7 of Wands is giving me one very specific theme here. You stopped fighting for access to someone who wasn't giving you clarity. And wait, that's important. Because I don't think the silence in this story is just about somebody not speaking. I think the silence changed you. At some point, you may have realized, I'm not going to keep proving that I care. I'm not going to keep explaining myself. I'm not going to keep knocking on a door that somebody else closed. And that boundary created space. Now, I'm not using this card to promise that a message will magically appear within 72 hours. I'm reading it as symbolisms. And symbolically, this is what happens right before a communication dynamic changes. One person stops pushing, and suddenly the absence of that effort becomes noticeable. But here's the part I want you to remember. There are 7 wands here, yet she isn't holding a single one. She's not defending herself by attacking. She's defending her peace by staying centered. And I feel like that's going to connect directly to why this sincere message carries more emotional weight than whatever communication happened before. Because whoever has been quiet may have expected you to eventually break first, to check in, to send something, to reopen the conversation. But something about you feels different now. You became harder to emotionally reach, not because you're cold, but because you're no longer standing outside someone else's walls asking them to let you in. And, okay, wait, look at the bubble around her. That is the detail I can't ignore. Because the next part of this reading isn't really about whether somebody speaks. It's about what finally becomes impossible for them to keep contained once they realize your energy is no longer pursuing theirs. And I have a feeling the next card is going to show us exactly what they've been holding back. Okay, and there it is, the Hanged Man reversed. And wait, because the first thing I'm noticing isn't even that she's suspended, it's that she's reaching. One hand is still holding on to the foot that keeps her in this position, but the other hand is stretching upward toward that light. And psychologically, that feels incredibly specific because this doesn't look like somebody who felt nothing during the silence. This looks like somebody who has been stuck inside what they haven't said. There's a difference. I don't think the emotional pressure here is simply, I miss you, so I should reach out. It feels more like they were able to stay suspended in this situation for as long as there was an unspoken assumption that you might eventually come toward them, that you might make it easier, that you might reopen the door so they wouldn't have to risk being the vulnerable one. But you stop doing that. And suddenly, the position that once felt safe starts feeling uncomfortable. Because look at this card. She can see the light. She's reaching directly toward it, but she hasn't released herself yet. And that feels like somebody who may have already imagined the conversation several times. Opening your messages, thinking about what they would say, typing something and deciding it sounds wrong, deleting it, coming back later, wondering how you're going to respond now that enough time has passed for the silence itself to become part of the problem. And I want to be careful here. I'm not saying this card guarantees somebody is going to contact you within 72 hours. But symbolically, the Hanged Man reversed can describe that moment when remaining inactive starts requiring more emotional energy than finally doing something. And that's what feels different. Your absence removed their ability to postpone this indefinitely without feeling the consequences of that postponement. But wait, there's another detail here. Her wrist is tied, and she is still reaching anyway. That makes me think whatever they want to say isn't only about their feelings now. There's something about how they left things that they haven't been able to completely make peace with. Something about the last interaction may have seemed easier to walk away from in the moment, but I don't think it feels that simple to them anymore. And, okay, the Fool. That changes the emotional tone of this in a really interesting way, because look at where she's standing. She's right at the edge. One foot is still on solid ground, but her body is already leaning beyond it, almost like she committed to the movement before fully understanding what would happen afterward. And psychologically, that feels very closest to whatever happened between you. Because I don't necessarily think this person planned for the silence to become this long. It may have started with one decision, one moment of pride, one conversation where something important didn't get said. Maybe somebody pulled away thinking, I'll deal with this later. Maybe they waited to respond, then waited a little longer. And eventually, enough time passed that reaching out became harder than it would have been in the beginning. That's what I'm getting from the edge of this card. There was probably a point where they assumed there would be another opportunity, another conversation, another opening. Maybe they thought you would create it, but you didn't. And now they're looking back at something they handled almost too casually and realizing it had consequences they didn't expect. And wait, look at what she's holding. That crystal is still in her hand. She didn't drop it, she didn't throw it away. So whatever emotional significance existed here, I don't think the issue was necessarily that they stopped feeling it. The issue may be what they did with those feelings. That's different. They may not regret caring about you. They may regret avoiding what caring about you required them to say. And underneath her, there are all these connected points. That detail makes me think the last interaction is connected to everything that came after it. One unanswered message becomes distance. Distance becomes assumption. Assumption becomes silence, and silence eventually becomes something neither person knows how to casually explain. But here's where this gets interesting. Because the Fool doesn't feel like somebody approaching with a perfectly rehearsed speech. If communication does open again, I actually think the first thing you see could look surprisingly normal, small, almost too casual, considering everything underneath it. A simple question, a familiar reference, something that gives them a reason to step back into the conversation without immediately exposing everything they've been carrying. And if that happens, don't assume the first sentence is the whole message, because I have a feeling the sincerity isn't going to be obvious in how they start. It's going to show itself in what they finally say once that door is open. And, okay, the Six of Swords. Now this is interesting because she's already in the boat. She's not standing on the shore deciding whether to leave. She's moving. But look at her face. She's turned inward, almost like part of her is still emotionally somewhere behind her, even though the boat itself is going forward. And that feels very connected to what we were just talking about. Because if somebody reaches out, I don't think they're necessarily going to begin by saying everything they've been thinking. They may test the temperature first. A simple check-in. A question that almost feels practical. Maybe mentioning something familiar. Something small enough that if you don't respond the way they hope, they can pretend there wasn't much behind it. And I don't automatically read that as manipulation. Sometimes people do that because they genuinely don't know whether they're still allowed emotional access to you, especially after they've been the one who created distance. Because now there's risk. Before, they may have assumed they knew where you stood. Now they don't. And wait, look at these birds. They're moving alongside the boat, but there are these thin lines connecting everything. That detail feels important because this doesn't look emotionally disconnected at all. It looks like somebody trying to move forward while still carrying threads back to what happened. So the first message may be simple, but what matters is whether the conversation stays simple. Does this person fall back into vague language? Do they avoid the actual issue? Do they make you do all the emotional work again? Or once that initial door opens, do they finally start naming things? That's where I think the sincerity would show itself. Not through some perfect opening line, through what they're willing to take responsibility for afterward. And the Six of Swords is making me think the communication could feel different because this person may finally understand that you weren't sitting still waiting for them. You were moving too, maybe quietly, maybe without announcing it. But emotionally, you started crossing your own distance. And okay, I think that's the part they misunderstood. They may have interpreted your silence as you still caring from the same place, still available, still waiting. But I don't think that's what happened. I think something in you actually changed position. And the next card feels like it's going to show exactly what they finally realized about why you stopped reaching back. And okay, Seven of Cups reversed. That actually answers something I was wondering about. Because look at him. All of these cups are above him. Different possibilities, different explanations, different versions of what something could mean. And he's underneath all of it, almost like he's been trying to make sense of too many interpretations at once. But reversed, this feels less like confusion expanding and more like confusion finally collapsing. And psychologically, I think that's what may have happened with your silence. At first, they could explain it however they wanted. Maybe you're angry, maybe you're trying to prove a point, maybe you'll calm down, maybe you'll reach out eventually. Maybe you still care enough to fix it. There were a lot of ways to interpret your absence without actually examining their own behavior. But eventually, those explanations stopped working. Because you still didn't chase, you still didn't reopen the conversation. And wait, this takes me all the way back to that Seven of Wands. That woman wasn't holding anything. She wasn't fighting. She wasn't trying to convince anybody that her boundary was justified. She just stayed inside it. And I think that may have been what this person misunderstood. They may have thought your distance meant you stopped caring. But those are not the same thing. You can care deeply about somebody and still decide, I am not going to volunteer for confusion anymore. That's a very different kind of silence. And sometimes people don't recognize how much emotional labor someone was doing until that person stops doing it. The checking in, the smoothing things over, the benefit of the doubt, the explanations, the willingness to keep the connection emotionally alive when the other person wasn't giving it the same clarity. When all of that disappears, suddenly they can see what you were carrying. Not because you're punishing them, because you're no longer carrying it for both of you. And here's where this gets more serious. Because if they reach out now, the question isn't just whether they miss the old connection. The question is whether they understand why the old dynamic stopped working. Are they coming back because your absence made them uncomfortable? Or because they've actually become willing to communicate differently? Because those are two very different things. And okay, the next card is going to matter a lot here, because I think it's about to show us whether this sincerity is just emotion or whether there's actual accountability underneath it. And okay, Page of Pentacles. Now, this is interesting because this card is much quieter than I expected. She's not rushing forward. She's not making some huge emotional gesture. She's holding that pentacle close to her body, almost carefully. Almost like she knows that if she's going to offer something now, she can't treat it casually. And that matters, because if this were only about loneliness, ego, or wanting to know whether you still cared, I would expect the energy to feel more impulsive. More like, let me see if I can still get a response. But the Page of Pentacles feels different. It's slower, more deliberate, and wait, look at her feet. One foot is planted inside that circle beneath her. She's actually standing somewhere. That sounds simple, but psychologically, that's important. Because sincerity isn't just somebody saying, I didn't mean for this to happen. It's somebody being willing to stand inside what actually happened. To say, I understand why you pulled back. I understand that my silence affected you. I understand that you don't owe me the same access I had before. Without immediately asking you to make them feel better about it. That's the difference I'm looking for here. Because somebody can miss you and still not be ready to take responsibility. They can feel lonely, they can feel nostalgic, they can suddenly become uncomfortable because you stop chasing. None of that automatically means they've changed. But okay, here's the detail that's shifting this for me. She's not reaching the pentacle outward like she's demanding that somebody take it. She's holding it carefully. And that feels like an awareness that whatever is offered now may have to be proven over time, not just announced. So if this message does come, the sincerity may show up through fewer excuses, less rewriting of the past, more acknowledgement, and maybe even an admission that sounds surprisingly vulnerable. Something like realizing they waited too long, or that they're afraid you won't receive them the way you once would have, or that they know you may see them differently now. And I think that's where the emotional weight is coming from. Because you're not as easy to pull back into the old pattern anymore. But wait, that brings up another question. Why now? What changed recently enough that staying silent suddenly became harder than risking the conversation? Because I don't think the next card is going to tell us more about what they feel. I think it's going to show us what finally disturbed the silence. And okay, Nine of Wands. Now this makes the timing make a lot more sense. Because look at her. She's already behind the boundary. She's not building it. She's not deciding whether she needs one. It's already there. And she's holding this one wand upright, like she's watching to see what happens next. That feels important because psychologically, I don't think the pressure is coming from some sudden burst of emotion. I think it's coming from the realization that your boundary has lasted longer than they expected it to. Maybe they thought you would eventually check in. Maybe something recently reminded them of you. A date, a place, a conversation with somebody else. Something ordinary that suddenly made the absence feel more real. Or maybe nothing dramatic happened at all. Maybe enough time simply passed that avoiding the situation stopped feeling easier. Because that's what the Nine of Wands looks like to me here. There has already been waiting, already been hesitation, already been mental back and forth. They thought about it, they delayed it, they justified the silence, they told themselves there would be another time. And now something doesn't fit anymore. And wait, look at the top of that wand. There's light there. She isn't just holding it defensively. She's holding something illuminated above all those other wands. That makes me think this is moving out of pure contemplation and into a decision point. Not necessarily, I know exactly what I'm going to say. More like, I can't keep pretending I don't need to decide whether I'm going to say it. And that's how I'm reading the 72-hour theme here. Not as a guaranteed clock, but as a symbolic window where something that has been internally delayed feels much more active, much harder to ignore. Because your life didn't stop. Your energy didn't remain permanently available in the same way. And sometimes that becomes very clear when somebody realizes the connection they assumed would stay open has actually changed shape. But, okay, here's the part that feels even more significant. She's holding one wand while the others create this barrier around her. So I don't think they're only deciding whether to communicate. I think they're deciding how much of themselves they're willing to expose once they do. Because there may be one truth underneath all of this that feels riskier than simply admitting they miss you. Something that would force them to explain not just the silence, but why they chose it when they knew what it could cost. And, okay, Two of Wands, this is exactly the kind of card I would expect to see here. Because look at her. She's holding one wand close to her body, but there's another one behind her. And she has the whole world sitting right beside her. That feels incredibly specific because this doesn't look like somebody who didn't know there was a choice. It looks like somebody who knew they had a choice and delayed making it. And I think that's the harder truth underneath the silence. Not necessarily, I didn't know what I felt. More like I knew this needed clarity, but clarity would have required me to decide what I was actually willing to do. And wait, that's different, because silence can feel easier in the short term. You don't have to risk rejection. You don't have to disappoint somebody directly. You don't have to admit that you're scared. You don't have to choose. You can just leave things suspended. But the problem is, avoiding a decision doesn't stop that decision from having consequences. It just means somebody else eventually makes one for themselves. And that's what you did. You stopped pursuing. You stopped trying to pull an answer out of somebody who wasn't giving you one. And suddenly, the choice they were postponing became real in a completely different way. Because now there's distance. Now there's uncertainty. Now, they don't know whether the version of you who would have patiently waited for clarity is still available. And look at the window. She's staring outward. There's all this space beyond her. Possibility. Movement. A whole world continuing whether she acts or not. That feels like the realization. They may have assumed there was more time. More time to explain. More time to decide. More time before your feelings changed shape. And now they may be confronting the fact that silence wasn't neutral. It was still a choice. That's the admission I think carries the most weight here. Not simply, I missed you, but maybe something closer to, I knew you needed something from me, and I avoided giving you an answer because I was afraid of what that answer would require. And if somebody says something that honest, that matters. But it doesn't erase what happened. Because hearing the truth and trusting somebody with access to you again are two completely different decisions. And I think that's where this reading is turning now. The question isn't only whether they're finally ready to tell you the truth. It's what you're going to do once you no longer have to guess. And, okay, the Devil reversed. That is a very interesting card to get here. Because normally, when people see this card, they immediately think about attachment, control, temptation, being stuck in something. But reversed, especially in this position, I don't think it's asking whether the connection still has a hold on you. I think it's asking whether you still have to participate in the same pattern just because somebody finally tells the truth. And wait. Look at the strings. That's the detail I can't ignore. There are hands above her. There are threads attached. But the whole card is reversed. So psychologically, this feels like seeing the mechanism clearly enough that it doesn't control you in quite the same way anymore. And that takes me right back to the Seven of Wands. That protective space around you was never about punishing somebody. It wasn't, I'm going to disappear so they understand what they lost. It was more like, I need enough distance to hear myself again. To figure out what you actually require from a connection when you're not busy trying to save one. And that changes how you receive a message. Because sincerity can be real and still not automatically mean reconciliation. An apology can matter. An explanation can matter. Somebody finally taking responsibility can matter. But none of those things erase your right to notice what happens next. Do they actually name what they did? Do they leave room for the fact that you may have feelings about it? Do they respect that you might need time? Or do they say something emotional and then quietly expect you to return to the old version of the connection? Because that's where this card becomes discernment, not suspicion. Discernment. You don't have to assume the worst, but you also don't have to hand your boundary back just because somebody finally knocks. And I think that's the shift. The message may answer a question you've carried for a long time, but it doesn't get to decide the future for you. You do. And, okay, there's one more thing here. Underneath all of these cards about communication, regret, timing, and truth, I feel like there's still one final layer we haven't touched. Why the silence had to become this meaningful in the first place. Because the last card isn't just going to tell us what happens between you and this person. I think it's going to show us what this entire silence changed in you, even if the message arrives differently than expected, or doesn't arrive at all. And, okay, Nine of Pentacles reversed. So that is such an interesting final card. Because look at her. She's surrounded by all of this growth. These pentacles are everywhere. Different sizes, different colors. Everything around her is alive. And yet the card is reversed. So psychologically, this doesn't feel like a story about whether you have enough. It feels like a story about whether you still need somebody else's response to tell you what your value is. And I think that's where the entire reading has been leading. Because at the beginning, with that Seven of Wands, you stopped fighting for access. You stopped knocking on a door that somebody else closed. And at first, that probably felt like loss. Like removing your effort meant removing your connection to the outcome. But wait, look at what she's doing here. She's reaching toward one of these pentacles, not begging for it, not chasing it. It's already growing in the same space she's standing in. And that feels important because the silence may have taken something away from you temporarily, but it also showed you what was happening every time you measured your peace by whether someone else chose to communicate. That pattern had to become visible. And once it did, you couldn't unsee it. So if a message comes within the next 72 hours, I think what makes it meaningful isn't simply that somebody finally speaks. It's that you are not receiving it from the same emotional position anymore. You're not standing outside the walls. You're not trying to earn clarity. You're not holding those 7 wands and fighting for an explanation. You're back inside that protective space. But now it feels less like protection and more like perspective. And if the message comes later or differently or not at all, that doesn't undo what these cards have been showing. Because your worth didn't become real when somebody noticed your absence. It was already there. Maybe the silence just forced both of you to see what the old dynamic had been hiding. Them behind avoidance, you behind effort. And I think that's the final piece. The sincere message may be something they send you, but the deeper sincerity here is the clarity that exists once neither person can keep pretending the old pattern was working. You don't need to chase the truth anymore. If it comes toward you, you can listen, you can decide, and you can stay centered while you do.